Hello, lovely queerlings. Leigh saying hi here in this little intro space to bring you a brief interview episode of History is Gay. This is actually a conversation I had nearly a year ago, and I'm glad to finally be bringing it to the feed for you to hear. I hope you enjoy this chat with Liz Gloyn, reader in Latin language and literature at Royal Holloway, where we talk all about queerness in the ancient world, shenanigans involving classical monsters, and more. I also just wanted to mention that in the interim between when we recorded this interview and now, Liz, just this last month in the beginning of July, had a new piece published for theconversation.com about the new DreamWorks film Ruby Gillman Teenage Kraken, and how the Kraken of Norwegian folklore has been interpreted in pop culture over the years. We'll throw that link in the article down in the show notes so you can read Liz's latest work. Thanks for your patience while I worked through some backlogs to get this episode out to you, and we'll have a full episode of History is Gay coming your way soon. Thanks. Love you.
We've always been here, every single year, from ancient gays right up to today's. See, history is queer. Some think it's a new way, but we've got something to say. History is very, 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 very gay.
Hello, everyone. Leigh Pfeffer here in your pod feeds for a fun bonus episode of History is Gay today. I got the opportunity to sit down with someone that actually one of our listeners connected me to, and I'm really excited to bring our conversation to you today. So I am sitting here virtually with the magic of the internet from across continents with Dr. Elizabeth Gloyn, who is a reader in Latin language and literature at Royal Holloway. She is a classicist who focuses on the intersection between Latin literature, ancient philosophy, and gender studies, and also does some really cool stuff about how people are interacting with and receiving classics in the modern world, especially around monster myths. So there's a lot of really fun bubbles of queerness and gender stuff that I am excited to talk to Liz today about. So, hi, Liz, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. I am lovely to be with you. Hello, folks listening. I'm coming to you today from a very, very warm part of London, where we're under
the balmy UK, as usual.
Yeah,
totally normal.
Known for our tropical weather. Absolutely, the way things always are.
Yeah, climate change. That certainly is a thing. Yeah, we got together because our lovely listener, Cheryl Morgan, who is a wonderful historian in her own right, back when we did our episode on Amazons and Scythians, basically was like, hey, I have spoken with this person to get a little bit more context about what was actually being said about these folks in this time, and trying to get, the actual language and context as opposed to various lenses being put on it. And so, I wanted to get the opportunity to just kind of talk with you a little bit more about your work and, what we can learn about queerness and gender dynamics and classics. And then your own kind of how you've gotten into the world of monsters, which has led you down some interesting roads, yes. At least from the last time we were talking off mic.
I feel I should say thank you, Cheryl.
Yes, thank you so much, Cheryl. And Cheryl, we will need to get together at some point and have a chat as well. But yeah, I know a little bit about you, and I've given the little Cliff's Notes versions, but could you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and the work that you're doing right now, and kind of how you came to classics?
Yeah, absolutely. So my era is I hang around a lot in the 1st century AD BC of the Roman period, and I ended up there having had the opportunity, very, very luckily, to do Latin at secondary school. So kind of picked it up at age 12, was lucky enough to follow that through, lucky enough to be able to go to Cambridge to do my master's there, did a PhD at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and again, lots of luck, able to get into an academic job And my research, the PhD research that kind of set the tone for everything that I care about since, was thinking about the family, and thinking about the family specifically in a system of thought called Stoicism, which was a really popular philosophy that sort of emerged from sort of the Hellenistic Greeks several centuries before, but by the time we get to Rome was really well established in sort of the Roman aristocracy as a way of thinking, and particularly through the writings of a guy called Seneca. Some of you may have heard of him sort of in his kind of other capacity, because he was the tutor and then the advisor to the Emperor Nero, who nearly everyone has heard of because of the fiddling when Rome burned thing, which it wasn't a fiddle, it was a lyre, but we'll put that to one side. But yeah, but
you mean it wasn't a devil went down to Georgia kind of situation?
Alas, no.
It's more of a
Sappho-esque moment.
Yes. Plucking the lyre.
Exactly. But yeah, so I was interested in this because ancient philosophy kind of says, okay, we're a system, we explain everything. And I went, oh, cool, being an excitable little undergraduate. Oh, cool, what do you say about the family? It's like, no, families do not exist in the scholarship. We have women. There are women in the scholarship. What do you do with women? They're just there. No, I'm sure this could not be right, I thought to myself. And, you know, it's one of those things where this is one of the reasons why having more voices and more perspectives and more people asking different questions coming into academia is really important. Because there'd been lots and lots of work done on women in ancient philosophy from particular standpoints. And it was really important work because even that hadn't been done before the 1980s, 1970s. You know, the thought that one might look at women.
What?
Why? Goodness. Sort of really emerges from sort of first wave feminist work, sort of coming out primarily from the States. But, you know, you get to a point when you're looking at a system that says we explain everything comprehensively, you get to a point where looking at elements of that system in isolation just kind of runs into a brick wall. And the conversations around women in ancient philosophy and Stoicism in these writers was very much, you know, is this stuff proto-feminist? Is this about being sort of like pre-feminist thinking? And the answer was no. They're living in ancient Rome. Of course it's not proto-feminist, which I mean is really easy for me to say several decades on. But at the time, that was quite important to establish.
Right. Yeah.
This was not the thing. And that there was some nuance going on here. But having got to that stage, people sort of then went, okay, we've answered the question.
Gonna put that away from now.
Exactly. And there sort of people weren't coming and thinking, what actually are the questions we can be asking, we can be doing. And so when I came and did my grad work, I was sort of asking, well, okay, so women don't actually just exist in this isolated void. They are part of the system, and the system that they are part of that feature in these works is the family. It's the core social structure. Nobody's looked at the family. People have written buckets and buckets on friendship. Thank you, Aristotle, for writing lots and lots about friendship, and therefore everyone thinks friendship is important because Aristotle thought friendship was important. You may hear me grinding my axe quietly there.
We're an editorial-free podcast.
But yeah, so because Aristotle had put so much emphasis on friendship, philosophical conversations through the resulting centuries also thought friendship was awesome and were really interested in that. But actually, the ancient Stoics had loads to say about the family. And the PhD was all about saying, well, what do they think about them? So going on from that, my interests have really been about what are the lives of men and women like romantically, socially in the ancient world. I think about literature. I think about philosophy. I am currently doing some things that aren't necessarily thinking about that so much because it's nice to have a break, especially when you've essentially spent nearly 10 years on the PhD book, right from the beginning all the way to it publishing. And you're like, I would like to do something else now, which is where the monsters entered into the picture. Having done like the heavy academic work, you're like, what can I do that's different to give my brain a rest or some variety? And then this project sort of was on the radar. Because the other thing I'm really interested in, as you said, is what happens with post-classical material. What happens when post-classical cultures get their hands on classical material? What do they do with it? And the thing that particularly nobody had talked about, which seemed to me really weird, you might be sensing a pattern. things that I think are really weird. This is how good research happens. You go, what do you mean nobody's thought about this? Why? Very well, I will go and do the thinking, which is why my book exists. So
it's why this podcast exists, honestly. It's like, wait a minute, it's, not a lot of people have like talked about this. I want to talk about this. I'm going to make people listen to me talk about this.
It is as good a reason as any. But yeah, so what I realized nobody was talking about was about classical monsters specifically and how they were being used. Loads and loads and loads about the hero. Oh, you could spend months just reading things about the hero in classical reception. Monsters, not so much. And I thought, that doesn't feel right. No. And so off I went and thought, what actually happens with monsters, classical monsters, when they get into modern culture.
Right. Well, beautiful. Well, we'll definitely circle back around to the monsters, but I kind of wanted to take us back to where this kind of conversation started. Is we got in touch via Cheryl when we were talking about Amazons and Scythians and the Inare. Could you tell us a little bit more about what you know regarding these folks and like what Ovid was mentioning of them? For those who hadn't listened to our episode on them, we had kind of discussed interpretations of the Inare, the kind of trans-analogous shamanesses or shamans of the Scythians, who interpretations were that they were using like mare's urine as a form of hormone replacement therapy, which, you know, some trans scholarship kind of took and ran with. But you had some more kind of some more nuanced interpretation of what Ovid is actually talking about at that point, if you remember and can pull out of your brain, which has many things in it.
Yeah, so this is one of those things where it's the word that's used is hippomanes, and it's a substance that we don't actually know precisely what it is. People have assumed it's urine, but it's sort of talked about as being, Ovid talks about it in his love poetry as being really important. And we do know sort of an aphrodisiac. We do know that it does seem to have this aphrodisiac thing. There is a passage from Pliny in his natural history where he talks about hippomanes. He says, if you mix it into bronze and make a statue of a mare, a female horse, all the nearby male horses will suddenly get terribly keen and interested in it sexually, which is helpful. But you know, it kind of indicates that, you know, hippomanes literally translates, the Greek is, hippos is Greek and manes is madness. It's literally just horse maddener. So there is kind of, it's said that it has to be produced by a loving mare. And another way to think of that, of course, would be a mare in heat.
Right.
So that, you know, this is whatever secretion a mare in heat generates to let gentleman mares know she is readily available. There are sort of some hypotheses that it may be something that comes from horse embryos, but that doesn't quite fit with what we know about sort of other secretions from, you know, what a loving mare would be doing this. Presumably by the point there's an embryo involved, she's already very well loved, we would hope. So yeah, I mean, I think this is one of those things where people look at an ancient text and they see a word and they sort of hope they think they know what it means and go for it, and then the internet does its thing. But I mean, it's still weird and wonderful and sort of quite fantastical. But at the same time, you know, there's something very different going on there with what the actual substance may have been. But as I say, because we don't have access to precisely what this item was, we really have to reconstruct from what the evidence sort of suggests to us. So urine doesn't. Let's put it this way. If Pliny the Elder had wanted to say you need to mix bronze with horse piss, he would have said so. Right. This is not a man who dances around the bush with. This is the man who says, do you know what's really good for these particular ailments? Beaver testicles. Go for it. Tie them to your forehead. It'll be fine. You know, he is not going to sort of try and pick a word that isn't straight up honest about the realities of life as Pliny the Elder. So hippomanes is clearly something slightly differently technical than urine, as they say.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Huh.
That may not have been where you thought that was going, but
no, it's great. It's you love a tangent about
beaver testicles.
Beaver testicles and urine. It's fantastic. I never know where conversations are going to go on this. It's fantastic. Well, so thinking about like the family in the ancient world and relationships and love, you know, specifically trying to think about where queerness, quote unquote, queerness fits in, because that has so many different kind of definitions everywhere. Obviously, most people will point to like Athens and ancient Greece and Romanos and Orestes. Like, what other elements of queer or, you know, non-normative, like we think about now, behavior or societal structure, gender presentation, philosophy kind of show up in the ancient world that interests you?
Yeah, so there is more than you would expect. So the first thing to say is that legally, in terms of legally recognized relationships, we're looking at hetero or nothing. That doesn't mean that hetero or nothing are your only options by any stretch possible. So first of all, the evidence for relationships between women, sexual relationships between women, is really, really, really thin. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Just means it's not documented.
Yeah, why would a bunch of men write about women in the ancient world? Why?
And the stuff that does turn up is sort of like, if you dream about two women doing this, then this is how you are meant to interpret it, which is like, okay, that was useful. But yeah, so there's sort of a way in which that is not particularly documented, not particularly talked about. And, you know, I mean, in a way, it kind of wouldn't be an issue in the same way, because in a terribly patriarchal situation like Rome, what you're worried about is you're worried about inheritance, you're worried about family transmission, you're worried about power, you're worried about sort of authority. Women having sexual relationships with each other, that doesn't threaten any of that.
Right.
You know, you can't have illegitimate children. A line isn't going to not be carried on because of this, you know.
So it's just kind of like a non-issue. It's like, we're not concerned about this, so we're not going to write about it, and we're certainly not going to moralize against it.
And the women who are engaging in it are not writing the stuff that survives.
Right.
And the people who might be rude about it have plenty of other things to be rude about women for. So I'm thinking particularly here of the satirist Juvenal, who writes lots of really, really rude stuff, but it tends to be more about women who are too manly. You know, he's got a really rude poem about a woman who sort of trains to be a gladiator and sort of how she practices too much and she's too manly. But, you know, that's sort of made into sort of crossing that boundary into manly behavior.
Right.
And what that means for her poor husband, rather than, and she also sleeps with girls because she's too butch. So, you know, there's a difference there. When it comes to men having relationships with men, the Romans kind of, in some ways, carry on the traditions of Greek pederasty to some extent. It's not as highly formalized as it is in 5th century Athens. There are, however, still some very firm rules about who is allowed to sleep with who, under what circumstances, when it's considered appropriate. And the critique that you get in the source that you will obviously hear quite a lot of the time, oh no, the Romans don't like same-sex relationships. The Roman thinks gay people are bad. But usually you don't have a look at the sources. It's a bit more complicated than that, because what really comes in for critique are men who prefer being penetrated, men who prefer having penetrative sex rather than being the penetrator. This comes back to what I said about Rome being a highly power-driven environment. Julius Caesar goes to Bithynia, has a relationship, some people gossip and say, with the king of Bithynia. Is the problem that he's having a gay relationship? No, the problem is that he might be the passive younger partner rather than a Roman dominating the Bithynian king, which would be totally cool and awesome within the power structure of the universe.
Right. It always comes back to that. It, like, in so many of these kind of dynamics, it's the kind of value judgment on the active versus passive partner.
Exactly. But again, there's some leeway, because if you are the younger partner, it's okay to be that, providing that when you've outgrown that, you enter into the dominant role. And this is sort of, again, Juvenal, great source for sort of loads of guys who sort of are like still trying to pretend that they're 18. Just grow up, guys. And there are all sorts of stereotypes about sort of being soft, and mollis is the Latin word for soft, and the clothes that you wear and the way that you behave and grooming you go through, depilation, all that kind of stuff. Marshall's also very rude about some of this kind of stuff. So there are a whole range of behaviours that are associated with men who've not transitioned into their proper social role, which is associated with being passive. To what extent there actually is a group of guys hanging out performing all of this, and to what extent it's like a social construct of, look at those people, you know, it is. I mean, we know from our own contemporary cultures, right, there are strong social conventions around, strong social stereotypes around, rather, you know, what being butch means, what being femme means, what being a bear means, all of those kinds of things. But, you know, if you were actually to sit one person down, try and assemble the group, you'd be like, right, well, you don't quite fit, and you don't quite fit, and your nails aren't painted properly, and there'd be a huge range of variations. So even though the group stereotype is attacked, you know, to what extent you could actually have sat down and said, here is this community of guys who are deviating from the norm, shock horror, you know,
right,
touch my pearls, is a bit tricky. And you've got to remember, you know, at the same time as sort of some of these people are writing these sort of scathing things, you've got Hadrian, who has as his lover Antinous. Now, obviously, there are huge issues about Antinous' ability to say no to the most powerful man in the empire. It is not the affirming homoerotic love story that everybody wants to make it. But you've got an emperor having a gay lover who, when he dies, makes him a god and builds temples to him. And folks go, You are the emperor. You were the one in charge. Tick box. There's a very different attitude, and this is coming out the same period that we've got people like Juvenal, like Marshall, like Seneca gets picked up on this. I get very irritated when people pick up Seneca on this for saying that gay sex is bad. What Seneca actually says is not that gay sex is bad. Seneca picks up a wonderful example. He does talk about people who, keep on sort of taking on this role once the bloom is faded off their cheek, and sort of parallels it to people growing flowers in hothouse gardens out of season. So again, it's about being seasonal. It's about everything at their right time. It's like, no, this is not the right time for this. You grow and you move past it. And the other lovely example is he talks about a particular guy who has his way enthusiastically with men and with women. And what Seneca gets really upset about is the fact that he does it in front of mirrors. It's not the bisexuality.
It's vanity.
Exactly. It's the luxury of having a room covered in mirrors, which for the Roman period, mirrors are complicated technology and expensive technology. It's the indulgence and the luxury, as opposed to the fact that there's sort of enthusiastic bisexuality going on. It's the cultural stuff in a much broader sense, rather than a straightforward denunciation of a particular sexual behavior. So these things are always more complicated when you go and unpick what actually is being disapproved of.
Right.
And it's also worth saying this is all stuff that's being said amongst the Roman elite. We don't know particularly how people further down the Roman social scale would have felt about this stuff. I mean, we can find insults, we can find the graffiti, and Pompeian graffiti is full of exciting things about who fucked who. And I use the word because that's what they use on the walls quite happily.
It's my favorite thing to see stuff from Pompeii. Just be like, humans have just been humans for a long time. Dick jokes have existed forever.
Both in words and in drawings.
Exactly.
But, so there's this sense in which we don't know what the people who are not sitting in this audience, in elite Roman senators, equestrians, wealthy Romans, we don't know what they would have thought about this. Would they have particularly cared much? Who knows? Obviously, you're living in a patriarchal system where you're sort of marrying and where your sort of your property control is passed down that line, where you've got the paterfamilias at the head of the family. You've got certain sets of structures, but actually, the further you come down in society, maybe the less attention some of that you have to pay to. Mm-hmm. Maybe it doesn't matter who you're going to be sleeping with or not sleeping with, because your family hasn't got particularly anything to worry about inheriting.
and certainly nobody's going to write about it.
Exactly.
Unless something was really upsetting the social structure, which is why you get writing on Amazons and writing on sleeping with somebody in a room full of mirrors.
Exactly.
Or even, taking it out of the Greek and Roman ancient world. Like you have, one of our earliest episodes was looking at queerness in ancient imperial China. And some of the texts that are like, hey, this is not okay, is not, hey, this is not okay, bisexuality is frowned upon. It's, hey, so you're giving your lover like really high positions in the military and government, and he doesn't have any of the qualifications for that. Maybe we should talk about that. Like,
maybe that needs revisiting.
That complexity of, people are so quick to put, their own
assume
interpretation.
It's exactly what it means. Exactly. Mm-hmm. We do have some evidence of sort of non-traditional family structures going on in these kinds of non-elite worlds. There's a lovely, lovely inscription, which is one of my favorites. And it's an inscription to a woman called Alia Potestas, who is an ex-slave. And it's really common to have inscriptions to people put up after they're dead, normally by loving husbands for women, normally husbands or fathers, depending on how old they are when they die, interestingly. But anyway, husbands to women. Now, the thing about Alia Potestas is that she is praised for all the usual things that women are praised for. She has been a wonderful woman, and she's going to leave those she leaves behind very sad. She's a great loss. The unusual thing about her is that rather than having one man put this tombstone up to her, two men put it up.
Aww.
And they are very explicit.
Delightful poly.
They are completely. They are absolutely explicit that, they all live together in the same house, that she led them together, like Orestes and Pylades, who are two characters out of Greek myth about whom there is an awful lot of homoerotic tension already in ancient Greece. They've not chosen this couple by accident. And so that you exactly have this vision of this little poly triad living quite happily together until poor Alia Potestas dies, and then they say, now she is gone, we will each go our own separate ways and live the rest of our lives out sad and alone.
Oh,
it's just
no!
I know.
Boys stay together. It's okay.
But it's sort of really. I mean, there have been some of the scholarship looks at this and goes, "This has got to be a joke. This has got to be a joke. This is just too over the top. This is." But then, actually, putting words on stone is expensive.
Yeah,
getting somebody to carve that stuff is expensive and time consuming. You don't put that in
for a lark.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, this may be a woman who neither of them would ever have really married. They may have had to go off and do other kinds of more respectable kinds of things with their lives. But, there's something genuine about that relationship that actually exists and actually happened, and that is not the kind of monogamous relationship that, maybe there are plenty of other of these things, but they end up breaking up because family concerns. Maybe this one gets captured because of poor Alia Potestas dying. Right. Rather than other kinds of pressures coming and ending that relationship, right? I mean, we just don't know. But the fact that it survives says that it's possible to do things differently, shall we say?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's, where you find one, it would be a stretch to say where there's one, there is only one, right?
Exactly. It might not be common. It might not be something that everybody knows. I was about to say not everybody knows somebody in a poly relationship. My guess is the people listening to this podcast probably know somebody in a poly relationship. But, it's probably something that is frequent enough that these kinds of arrangements, which they wouldn't have conceptualized as poly in the same kind of way, obviously that's a modern framework, but... Right. The kind of relationships where you've got people living in structures that are outside that very traditional, heteronormative, patriarchal, this is the way it is, there is space for them in the Roman world.
Oh, man. Well, speaking on, looking at things in a modern framework, let's circle back a little bit more to the reception side of your research, the reception of classics, especially, so you write and you teach a lot about monsters. You've worked on this book. Why do you think monster myths and stories have held such a strong place in pop culture, especially among queer and other marginalized communities? That was something that you were telling me a little bit about, that you were really rather surprised to find some stuff in your research.
Yeah. So there is a big field of monster studies. There's been a field of monster studies since about the 1990s. There was a really influential book by a guy called Jeffrey Cohen. He had a really influential article called The Theses of Monster Studies. I've got the title wrong, but you'd be able to find it easily. And that kind of was like the foundational piece of this field. And one of the things that folks working in monster studies have found is recently, last 10 years or so maybe, is the way that LGBT plus people have used monsters as a reclamatory device. And if you think about it, that makes perfect sense, because for so long, people who haven't hit the het norm get told you're a monster, you're awful, you're hideous. It's a label that's applied to people to indicate disapproval, which sounds like a really mild way of expressing how that actually lands if you're the person being told it, right? And I apologize if that isn't sort of quite getting across the violence that term has been used for people. And the effects it has on them, particularly if, say, you're living in an isolated town, you are, as far as you know, the only person who feels this way or has this identity or desires in this fashion, and what you get told is you're a monster. The closet is there for the monster to hide in for a reason.
Right.
But over the last, let's say, 5-10 years, there's been sort of a real movement for people who identify as LGBT to say, yes, I'm a monster. Hi.
Right.
Coming out of the closet. Two really good examples of that. First of all, are Lady Gaga, who calls herself the Mother Monster, and then talks about all her little monsters deliberately reaching out to those kids who may be gay, lesbian, bi, trans, other identities, who do feel like they're the only ones, and saying, no, hi, I am Mother Monster, and there are all these other people who are also part of the family, and sort of making that an identity that becomes a powerful family uniting one, rather than no, I am all on my own in my own little cave with nobody to be to. So it sort of becomes a transformation of that metaphor into family. And on the other hand, you have, I don't know how many of folks listening watched the film The Babadook. I never watched the film.
I have a feeling it's a pretty big intersection.
Yeah. But I never watched it. But even I know that the Babadook became a massive queer symbol precisely because the Babadook itself lived in a closet and was clearly about sexual orientation. And so the prides after the Babadook came out, you had the Babadook is Baba Shook t-shirts. You had the posters. You had people dressing as the Babadook. You know,
the B in LGBT stands for Babadook.
Exactly. Yeah. You know, there was sort of a massive sense in which the audience who watched these films went, "Oh my goodness, it's my sexuality on screen and tiny and black and with feathers." But you know, there's that sense of reclamatory. I don't think that could have happened 20, 30 years ago. I don't think that kind of popular sense of here is something that's been presented as the horror in the horror show, and actually no, that's us. We will take that.
We will take it and make it ours. I mean, that goes back to, I mean, it goes back so long with like the tradition of queer coding in media, right? It's like queer people have latched on to villains for so long because often that's the only time in which we saw these like markers of ourselves represented back.
Exactly. And the whole move of that sort of being called by the Hays Code and the imposition of sort of, no, you can't possibly have a queer character on screen. But we can give all their behaviours to the baddies. Which turns up even in Disney, which is really upsetting to my students when I tell them that. But yeah, so that is kind of what's happened with monsters. There is this kind of trend. And when I started looking into classical monsters, I was like, okay, so where's the LGBT stuff? And it wasn't. It's really interesting. Classical monsters in mainstream media, important note, do not get used so much for this expression of queer identity, queer belonging, queer reowning, which is what I wrote in the book. And then I did the article that I've just finished off and hopefully will be turning up at some point, touch wood, in which I had the chance to, so the editor asked me, would you go and write about classics and popular culture for this book? And I was like, well, I can't not, can I really? I am popular classics and monsters lady. This is my chapter.
Yes, please let me. And you're going to pay me to do it? Great.
So I then sort of went off and looked at what I could do, and I was like, well, what I didn't do in the book, and I kind of feel I really should have done, was look at some of the stuff that's happening with classical monsters away from the mainstream in other kinds of popular, much more popular media production. So I went and had a look at fan fiction and spent far too long looking at Archive of Our Own. And I will imagine that numbers of your readers are now going, oh, she did what? Yeah, I did.
Congratulations. Your monster fuckery may have been read and used in research by Dr. Elizabeth Gloyn.
You'll just have to check the citations. But yeah, so I went and had a look at this, and you are absolutely right. The monster fuckery was there. Lots of other things. Monsters used for lots of other things as well, I should say. But all of the reclamatory narratives about reclaiming LGBT identity from monsterism, from being a monster in that negative way, all of those stories were turning up in the fan fiction, which for me was like, oh my goodness, we're doing it somewhere, thank heavens. That's completely off the map. But it was really interesting. I mean, for instance, Medusa, there's a whole group of Medusa, so I'm sure your readers know this. I'm sorry if I'm sort of helping my audience suck eggs, teaching my audience to suck eggs, but
it's fantastic.
There's a whole group of Medusa stories which are really tender lesbian love stories. And sort of really gentle and affectionate and sort of healing from trauma-y. And, you know, and that all comes from the Medusa, a better understanding, I think. And of course, this is now taught much better than it was 50 years ago. Obviously, we didn't have the internet and AO3 50 years ago, but we'll put that to one side. But the better understanding of Medusa's origin story as told by Ovid as being one of rape and violation. And the number of people who have sort of taken that into sort of a space of reclamatory, romantic identity healing is intensely powerful. On the other side, there's the Minotaur.
Long pause
as she works out how to say this academically. Let us say that the Minotaur's raw animal energy and eroticism definitely comes through. There's one lovely story which everyone will now go and find. It's only a short one. In the tagline was, "You go into the labyrinth and what you find is romance." And it's a really sweet, lovely, fluffy story that isn't heavily full of monster fuckery, but it's such an interesting example because all the other ones of the Minotaur are right, here we go.
Right.
And so it was a really interesting example to find somebody who was writing, knowingly or otherwise, against those kinds of literary conventions as part of that range. But yeah, so the space at the moment where that reclamation of identity seems to be coming through is in that space rather than mainstream media, including video games. I mean, it's just not to say that video games, I'm working with a master's student at the moment who's doing her dissertation on computer games and sort of the family and mythic computer game stuff. Really interesting work, really cutting edge stuff on our master's in classical reception. And I am not a gamer. So I've been learning all of this through her, which is fantastic. And she, but what sort of come out of that really is the way that these games are using LBGT identities in some sort of quite interesting ways. But again, it's always with the mythic characters. It's always with the mythic characters. It's not with the monsters.
Not with the monsters.
Exactly. As opposed to, as I say, in other kinds of narrative where the monster becomes the figure, where people with LBGT identities sort of place themselves and reclaim that space. You know, the figures of myth seem to be where people go. So yeah, it's sort of an unexpected way in which classical myth doesn't do quite what other things, which is one of the reasons for studying this stuff, right? Because otherwise you just go, oh no, it's all exactly the same for all sorts of monster, and then there's just us sitting over here. Hello.
Please pay attention. Hello.
Yeah, well, this is why the book was written, because when I sort of sat down and went, well, so what have people written about classical monsters and classical reception and sort of monster theory? And it was like, no, you don't exist. What do you mean we don't exist? You don't exist. I can give you serial killers. I can give you Jaws. I can give you all sorts of other things. I can give you zombies and werewolves. Do you like zombies and werewolves? It was like, but no, I'd like some classical monsters, please. No, we have none of those. Exorcism is good. No. So, but, you know, it's kind of these patterns that are really well understood in some fields, and then we don't fit into them as classical reception. The classical reception outputs don't fit into them, and yet they need to. We need to sort of be thinking about these things all at once.
Right. And it's so interesting to see that the world of like contemporary, like mainstream media, or even just like more produced media, is so far removed from the fandom experience, right? Where it's, I mean, I think you said it best, like as a fandom person, right? As somebody who is in the internet all the time, is, you know, you said in our last conversation, you could, when you were starting to do this research and you when you got into the fanfic, you couldn't move without falling over gay Medusas. Is this line that I have in our notes from last time.
Pretty much.
Which is kind of my experience as well. It's surprising to be like, oh yeah, you know what? I really haven't seen that anywhere other than these like pockets of kind of microfiction. You know, it's you see it in fan fiction, but you also see these like posts on Tumblr. You know, people just kind of create mythologizing within the mythology of like, we've created this entire structure on the internet of queer Medusa that's just a trope at this point.
Exactly, but it hasn't made its way off that space. And I mean, this is one of the things I think that classical reception studies needs to do. I'm not sure these days I'm the person to do it, partly because of being too old, partly because of not being too plugged into a lot of those spaces. I mean, you know, nobody has to explain to me what slash is. I'm that much on the internet. But I may have written that in the introduction of this article. That may make some people sad. Anyway, but there's the sense in which somebody at some point is going to need to actually get to grips with how this really vibrant, uncontrolled culture, and use uncontrolled there as an unmediated, all you have to do to upload this stuff is to do it on your computer and press up, and it's there. There's no form of, obviously some forums are more mediated than others, some have beta reading systems, all the rest of it, but you know, there are places like Archive of Our Own where you can just press upload and suddenly it's there for the internet to see, right? And the same with DeviantArt and Tumblr as well, all these other spaces where it is raw popular culture. There is no intermediary. There is no intermediate space. Nobody doing quality control. Right. And quality control, of course, cuts both ways. as anyone who spent any time on these things knows, there's some stuff that comes up and you get, and the next. And then there's stuff that comes through that's absolutely superb. And my version, my sense of what is superb and what somebody else is, they're not going to necessarily be the same, I hasten to add. But the point that there is no filter, there is no quality control, and I use scare quotes around that, means that there's nobody saying, well, we can't have that because that's just too queer. There's nobody saying, well, we can't do that because that won't sell. Selling isn't the point. That's not the point of this kind of creative enterprise and this environment. So it's a really different world in which that sense in which the classical monster's queerness can do its thing. And the fact that I think if you look at classical monsters in mainstream, more curated media, more gatekept media, they're really used in a very kind of canon foddery, hero attached kind of way. Literature, not so much. The written word is much better about that kind of thing, but sort of the visual film and television have really quite conservative, with a small c, senses about what monsters do. And it's really interesting that the flow through hasn't quite got there. In some interesting ways. As I say, I have yet to encounter, I think, a queer Medusa. If listeners would like to tell me where your queer Medusas in mainstream media are, please tell me. I should be delighted. But this is the other thing about doing popular culture studies. You're like, no, I think I found everything. And then somebody pops up and goes, there was this thing. Oh.
Right. Always mortified. Yeah.
Exactly. Which is delightful and also means that nothing is ever complete.
I mean, it means you will always have work, right?
There's always more to say.
Well, so what does the actual text say about monsters, and kind of what's the difference or kind of, similarities that we're seeing between what is actually in the text and modern reclamation?
Yeah, so obviously monsters from ancient Greek myth, starting with ancient Greek, that Romans kind of inherit and build on it, are originally really interested in the division in between chaos and order. And chaos is gendered feminine, because obviously women. And order is masculine and ordered and rational, and chaos is irrational and wants to destroy things. Yeah. So you get foundation myths. You get, for instance, Zeus, the leader of the Olympians, fighting against various forces of the giants, that kind of thing. And that becomes about the Olympian rationality, bringing in the golden age of the Olympians and putting away all of that kind of irrational feminine stuff led by the monsters, and monsters generated by monstrous women, monstrous gods and titans. So that whole vibe is really about the establishment of rationality and male authority, and that kind of keeps going. And you also get sort of monsters that are about women's sexuality, women sort of as being dangerous if they're sort of sexually free. Mind you, this is where if we're not careful, we start having Freud's view of Medusa, which is frankly just disturbing. He goes for a whole vagina dentata.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, well, yeah, you haven't had to read him on it. It's
Oh, Freud.
Yeah.
Oh, Freud.
But I mean, you don't quite have to go to that level of the psychoanalytic spectrum to sort of be able to see that there are far more monsters who are gendered as female in the ancient world, and they're normally threatening men who are trying to do something like heroes, like bring order to the world in some kind of exciting way.
Right.
So that sort of is their central thing. Now, as monsters come through in the classical reception element, I mean, they are hugely adaptable. As I say, depending on what's going on with them, they do sometimes just end up riding on their hero's coattails, and they end up being cannon fodder, because you can't tell the story of Theseus without the Minotaur. You can't tell the story of Perseus without Andromeda, and Andromeda nearly beaten by the sea serpent. But yeah, so, you get these heroes who bring monsters with them, and then you kind of just have to have them. But at the same time, you also get the monsters finding spaces for themselves to represent other kinds of fears, other kinds of worries. The Minotaur, for instance, again, this is psychoanalysis, there's a lot to answer for here, does become a little bit of representation of sort of the uncontrolled male sexual ego and the violence it can do. Picasso has a whole series of posters of him as a Minotaur. posters, paintings, sketches, drawings, in which, in some cases, the Minotaur is just kind of like hanging out, not doing very much, just like relaxing. And then in others is sort of engaged in sort of quite disturbing activity. So sort of this is, part of Picasso exploring his own maleness. But, that kind of through that artistic endeavor. And, if that's how you conceptualize what you're doing, that's how you conceptualize what you're doing. And of course, the whole, again, psychoanalytic idea that, the monster within the maze, you're always trying to search for the monster within your maze to conquer it. And it turns out to be you all along. But
it's the opposite of like the lesson was the friends we made along the way or whatever.
Exactly, yeah. But, all these ideas have been really influential as ways of thinking about, for instance, human psychology, and sort of they then turn up in cultural practice with these kinds of weights on them, because this is when people think of the Minotaur, what do they think of? Oh, great, sexual threat, male sexual threat, aggressive male sexuality, toxic masculinity. It becomes a doorway into other kinds of concerns and other kinds of worries. You have got monsters in the ancient world who represent this stuff. You have the centaur, who represents the dangers of hypermasculinity, because if they like to fight, they don't listen to reason, they like to drink too much, they try and abduct women. They're generally bad news, apart from Chiron, who is the tutor of lots of heroes, who sits in a cave and goes, no! Don't talk to me about my family.
Stop making me look bad.
No, I will not come to the weekend cookout because I know what's going to happen. I will not bail you out again. Anyway, so he is sort of the exception that proves the rule, and all the other centers are sort of over the top. But they, again, have that kind of over the top, uncontrolled masculinity, uncontrolled verge to violence, uncontrolled push to, excess of every possible kind. And they're countered by heroes who are meant to have all of this kind of stuff in control, except, in some authors, they have it more under control than others. Let's put it that way. So, yeah, those kinds of core concerns about gender performance and what all of that means, again, they don't go away.
Right. And leave, plenty of room for ripe interpretation.
And reimagination, exactly.
And as we deconstruct them, yeah. Oh, well, I would love to continue talking with you all day. I feel like, I feel like we will have a tendency to do that. We might actually be here all day. But I kind of wanted to, lead us into the wrapping up of things and just kind of ask you, what projects are you working on now? Is there anything new and exciting in the pipeline that you are really looking forward to?
Okay, so I should say the monster book is already out. It's called Tracking Classical Monsters in Popular Culture. It's from Bloomsbury, and if I may say so, the paperback is extremely reasonably priced.
We'll put some links in our show notes for this episode.
So there's the chapter, as I said, on fan fiction, which is going to be in a big companion for Oxford. So that will be out at some point. She says, I'm not the volume editor. I don't have to care. I just send my text off and then magically it happens. Somebody else does the work. I've got another chapter that I'm doing about a historian on Valerius Maximus, and a post-colonial reading basically saying, so this whole thing, this is basically just like imperialism, right? As opposed to Romans are awesome. There's actually a lot of imperialism going on in this text. Again, it's one of those things where you're like, this is blatantly obvious and nobody's ever written about it. So here we go. There are two current big projects. One of them, the serious academic one. Again, you'll spot a trend here. There is a philosopher called Musonius Rufus, who lives a little bit after Seneca. So he kind of spans the 1st and 2nd century AD. And we have fragments of him. He was hugely influential in his own time, and he's just kind of fallen out of things. So I am co-editing a big volume with my colleague, John Sellers of Royal Holloway, of essays about him. And I'm doing a chapter on if it's ever right to disagree with your parents, which is all kinds of fun, not least as it seems to be the only text I think I've ever read that's actually talked about what happens when you're like old enough to have your own opinions, according to Stoicism. So you've reached the age at which you can have rational thought. But also you kind of have to deal with your dad. It's within a Roman hierarchical system where the paterfamilias is at the top of it. I don't think I've ever read anything that's actually addressed this question before.
Like so that tension.
Exactly. How do you do that? Mysonius there are all sorts of answers Mysonius gives, but he also goes, and by the way, did you know that Zeus is top dad? And
don't tell him that.
Well, having Zeus, oh dear God, that was not a good choice of word, was it?
No, I'm just saying, yeah, don't tell Zeus that he's top dad.
Bad things will happen. Anyway, Zeus is chief dad, boss dad, and that means that what he as a dad wants for you is more important than what your mortal dad wants for you. So that's fine. Anyway, so I'm writing that and we're doing that volume, and that's really interesting because nobody has written about Mysonius for years. I say that a couple of really good things have come out of the French tradition, but yeah, as a rule, he's not thought about. It's like, why? But the other thing I've been doing is I'm currently doing a little bit of work for Dorling Kindersley, who are doing a new illustrated Rome volume on illustrated Rome, which is going to be full of beautiful pictures and fantastic text, and really, really quite lush. And I've got to do the sex, love, and relationships spread for that, which I know is quite exciting. So Alia Patostas turns up in that, I'm glad to say. Yes.
I'm gonna look forward to that. Be looking out for it, but you'll have to let us know when that happens. Well, I mean, I figured, before I ask you where people can find more about you and your work if they want to snoop on the internet, other than just, finding you in your books. As a final question, we've been circling around this kind of the whole conversation, but I like to ask this to a lot of folks that I talk to in these kinds of episodes is, why do you think it's important specifically to look to history for ways that we can interpret and influence the future?
Big question.
So
I think history is valuable for a lot of reasons. History helps us tell stories, helps us understand how we've got to where we are. If we understand the historical path that's got us from X to Y to where we are now, we can actually understand how we've got here. And, and that means actually looking at it properly. It means not accepting the history that the Victorians or earlier generations decided was the history. Right. As I say, actually understanding from a queer perspective that there's a huge range of relationships going along in Rome. Yes, okay, it's highly patriarchal, it's highly structured, but at the same time, lots of other stuff is happening, actually. So having an understanding that there's more diversity, there's more difference, there's more variety than, that shut down version of the world. And what does that do? Well, actually, it lets us see that shut down versions of the world are not the only versions that we have. And it helps us ask good questions about what might we do differently, which is not to say the ancient world was a lovely, wonderful place. I'm very glad to be living in the 21st century with medicine and other things. And, I don't know, being able to vote, being able to go and have influence on the political system and, as a cis woman, all of that kind of stuff, which would not have been possible for me in ancient Rome.
Right.
So, there are all sorts of things that, it's not to suggest that everything in the ancient world is groovy, but how they cope with stuff, how they approach things, the kinds of things that they tell us mean we've then got better questions to ask of our own time and to think about what kind of imagining might we take forward. And this is sort of something from the classical reception side that's really exciting because, you sort of ask, well, what does this use of the classical tell us about the culture that's using it? And you both then can say, and then what questions does that mean we can now take back to antiquity and ask that material that we couldn't ask before? But we can also say, and what are the problems with that? And what happens if we deal with it differently? What are the versions of the ancient world can we show? And that's how you end up wading through queer Medusas.
Swimming through, wading through. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for this. I've had so much fun in this conversation.
It's been lovely. It's been great.
I really hope people enjoy this. I get to go, when we hang up, I get to go back to a Xena Discord friend group and be like, so I got to talk to a classicist about monster fucking today, guys. My life's great.
I was about to say there is less monster fucking in Xena than you expect, which is also true.
True, and also multiple centaur births.
Yeah, the book has bits on the centaur births.
In Xena? Beautiful.
In Xena and in Hercules, because there are parallels.
Oh, yes.
It's, anyway, that's, there there.
I know, yeah, I know. We're like skirting into into tangents and entire more conversations. Well, so yeah, needless to say, it's been a joy to talk with you. Thank you so much. Where can people, respectfully stalk you on the internet to find out more about what you're doing?
Okay, so the best place to find me is Twitter, where I am Liz Gloyn. And that is where I am most of the time. I also have a blog, which is Liz Gloyn on WordPress. My last name is Gloyn. Do not put an E on the end. People are tempted to. So yeah, those are the best two places to find me.
Awesome. I hope that folks will go and check that out and check out your work and buy your book. And I hope that this is not the last time that we talk. I'm sure that there will be many more opportunities for us to connect because, as is obvious, we just keep wanting to talk to each other. So
it's been lovely to join you. Thank you for having me.